Good afternoon. Thank you, Newcastle, for showing up for this annual event. We have and are honored by having Mr. Steve Rippy here today to enlighten us about the first 30 years of Newcastle. And I can tell you about the last 30 years of Newcastle. My wife and family moved here. There were 800 people living here. And I think Steve's going to go through some population statistics also. But before we get started, can we all stand, take our hats off for the Pledge of Allegiance, please? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. For those that don't know who I am, my name is Art Riddle. I'm the current mayor of Newcastle. I'm in my 8th year, I think. However, Mr. Steve Rippy was mayor of Newcastle for how many years? 7. I beat you. He was also the town administrator for 5, and now he's currently the administrator up at Battlement, Mesa. And I was just sharing with him a great quote that he gave me several years ago. He loves his administration job at Battlement Mesa because he doesn't have a police department to deal with. So, yeah, with that, Steve Rippy and his family have lived here for years and years and years. And so he is our local historian, along with Joe McNeil. So let's welcome Steve Rippy.
Let me just give a little background with this. And the reason I have focused on the first 30 years is Newcastle. I have studied the history of Newcastle from its beginning through, as Art was talking about, even in the last few years. Every day is a piece of history eventually, right? So one of the things that I realized was, you know, that first 30 years, kind of like the last 30 years, boom, there's a lot of activity going on. Well, that first 30 years had a lot of activity going on, and it's a little more difficult to understand and dig into that information if you don't know where to find it. And fortunately, living here and having such an interest in it, you know, I've spent about 30 plus years digging through this stuff, and then the internet came along, which was awesome because there's so many newspaper articles that you can now search online that put a bunch of these pieces together. How many of you are on Facebook and part of that Newcastle history site? Excellent. That thing, when it got formed about 7 or 8 years ago, has helped me with so many pieces of things. Just, you know, one of the keys to learning history is constantly studying the photographs. Because it can be, some people don't even realize the value of the photograph that they might have. It's a family member that was taken out in front of the house. Well, they don't even know what's in the background. They may not even understand it. What that does for me, I can pick a piece out of that and go, that's exactly what I thought was going on there, but I had no proof to show that. So again, with that length of history, I said, you know what, I'm gonna have to zero in on the first 30 years because you guys probably don't want to be here till tomorrow. And actually, it's probably the least amount of things that we actually know about. And I call the first 30 years the extremely active years where the town really got formed. Then I call the next 70 or 80 years the quiet years, where it became more of a farming community, more of a Midwestern type of town. And I'd love to report on that sometime. And that can be a very interesting study as well. So with that, I'm going to get started, and I'm going to tell you that I don't have all the answers. And I don't know that I will ever have all the answers. I don't know that anyone will have all the answers. But I did put enough together that I think I can give you a summary and a story about the town. And that 30-year period is 1883 to 1913. And even though we know the town wasn't incorporated till 1888, the activity that got it going started in 1883. So we're going to start there. This picture is interesting because we were debating the year on it, but very early photo. I'm going to say we're going to go with circa 1900 because I haven't pinned it down exactly, but pretty quiet town, even though we had a lot of mining activity going on. So keep an eye on me, Mindy.
I gotcha.
Jasper Ward, and I think everybody here may have heard of Jasper Ward. Jasper Ward and his family came from Missouri and ended up in Denver in 1884. He was a freighter, so freighters in those days were basically guys that owned a bunch of donkeys, and they, mule teams, donkey teams, or whatever. But he hit basically every mining community along the Continental with his brothers. And I mean, we're talking, he was in Aspen, he was in Leadville, he was in Kokomo, he was in St. Elmo, he was everywhere. And he built up a string of 75 donkeys at one point. And his brothers had been in this valley prior to that, and he had come from a farming background, so he wanted to get into farming. He was kind of getting tired of the freighting business. And his brothers told him about this valley, and he came down the Ute Trail from Carbonate all the way down Canyon Creek, and he'd hoped to settle on Canyon Creek. But all those lands were already taken. So he ended up moving west, and he settled, he and his wife, Annie, whoops, I told you about that. He and his wife, Annie, picture of them, probably taken, everything that's photo taken of him is going to be before 1887. And the reason for that, and this is his friend, Chief Colero. So everybody knows Colero Trail up here, and we've heard about the Ute Chief. Well, he settled, so back up just a little bit here. So Jasper and his wife, he built a cabin on Elk Creek, on the west side of Elk Creek. And during that time frame, the Ute Indians would come through here because this was part of the northern Ute tribe lands, and huge, huge area that they covered. Colero was the chief that was part of the Meeker Massacre, the last Ute War, which was, I think they even called that Colero's War, which took place in 1887. Colero would stop at Ward's place, and they became friends over time. He would, partake in meals there. So in 1887, what we call the last Ute War or Colero's War, Jasper was a sheriff deputy for the county, and he put together a posse, and they used him as a friend of Colero's to try to subdue this thing before it got out of hand. Unfortunately, some of the people that were in that posse ended up firing off some shots, and he ended up getting killed in return shots in 1887. So it's kind of interesting that the town was incorporated in 1888. We look at Jasper as being the person that settled the town. Settled the town maybe is not the appropriate way to talk about it. He's the first settler on land that was incorporated as part of the town. So that's why he gets, but it gets real confusing here. So stay with me as we go through this. So anyway, he passes in 1887. Look at this plat of the town of Newcastle. Does that look weird? Carbondale town site. Now, the interesting part about this is it was surveyed July of 1883 by B. Clark Wheeler. And you'll see down here at the bottom, it's kind of hard to see, that's why I wanted those toolbars away. It says Mace's Cabin, Mace, M-A-C-E, on the west side of the creek. Well, reading all the descriptions of Jasper Ward's cabin, I know that that's Ward's cabin. It's not Mace's. And what we had was two brothers, George and John Mace. George Mace filed a claim in 1883 on coal lands, which were basically Burning Mountain area. John Mace, I don't even know how this came about, but John Mace had a ranch somewhere in here. Now, Jasper Ward's claim on land, it was the Ute Series of 23 when they opened up the Indian lands. He got 160 acres. And from what I'm reading, everything that he purchased was on the west side of the creek. And I'm assuming that Mace had some on the right side of the creek. I don't know. It's just very confusing. And what I'm thinking happened here is there may have been several claims filed in 1883 with overlapping legal descriptions. So B. Clark Wheeler purchased the land from John Mace and platted this. And to give you a little background on B. Clark Wheeler, this is him. He's in the Hall of Fame of Aspen as a Hall of Fame member of that community. And what he did, as you just saw with that plat, He did that for Aspen, but Aspen wasn't called Aspen at the time. He's the one that came up with the name Aspen. So he became very famous in Aspen, but he was also an entrepreneur and very politically engaged. His father-in-law would become the governor of Colorado in the 1890s. The interesting part about that is if you ever look at the abstract, and everybody know what a real estate abstract is, where you've got, especially the old ones, they would have every deed that ever happened all put into a binder. And what you'll see with those is you'll see that Jasper Ward's name is on there, as is John Mace's. Now, John Mace couldn't read or write, and so he used X to sign those deeds over to Wheeler. The person that witnessed his X was the governor of the state. He wasn't the governor of the state yet, but would be the future governor. So we have all of this stuff coming together, and what Wheeler brought with him was investors. This is Jerome Wheeler, and everybody know who Jerome Wheeler is? From Aspen, Wheeler Opera House, the Hotel Jerome. He was a 50% owner in Macy's of New York. And he didn't come by that. His wife was actually the descendant, but he got married, he ended up with 50% of it. So he was financially set. And he was doing the smelters in Aspen and the silver mining in Aspen. He needed coal. He was also an investor in the Colorado Midland Railroad. They had a ton of money to go into these lands that they were going to develop. And the mine that they were going to develop is what we call a consolidated mine. One of the other investors that they had, let me see if I got a better one. There we go. Walter Devereaux. Walter Devereaux, Glenwood Springs, built the Hotel Colorado, built the hot springs pool, also financially set. So they had some heavy hitters coming in to invest in the consolidated mine. Everybody know where the consolidated was? That's Burning Mountain. So west of the creek, the lands that Jasper Ward would have owned. And apparently George Mace too. This is an interesting photo. So at the time that Jasper Ward was living in Newcastle, the community was called Chapman because they got a post office established at that cabin. So Jasper Ward was the first postmaster for this community. And this is the only map I've come across, but I hope I hope you can see it in the back, but it says Chapman. Ferguson, anybody know who Ferguson is? Silt. Yeah, George Ferguson. George Ferguson, who's buried at Highland Cemetery, by the way. And he had a ferry, and so it was called Ferguson Crossing. So anyway, it was named Chapman, and I will tell you, I spent 20 plus years trying to figure out who the hell was Chapman. I'm trying to figure out where that name came from, and it wasn't until about 4 or 5 years ago I found an old article in the Avalanche Echo in Glenwood Springs from 1893. The post office named it that. Whether they got a name from somebody that was in charge of some area or whatever, it has no real bearing on our community. So if you're looking for Chapman, I don't know what you'll find him. Now this is the interesting part. So we always look at Newcastle and we think it just, you see it today and you don't see a lot of activity, or you don't see the spruce and the cedar and everything else that we had. This photo was taken probably early 1880s, and it's called. Is this visible at the back well enough to make it out? This on the back of this photo says Barrett's Camp, which was a hunting camp, and you can see they have different animals in here. We all enjoyed this one. None of us have been able to figure out what this animal is, by the way. It's kind of creepy looking. Anyway, that tells you the terrain that they're in. Well, the photo isn't that great. I think the original shows a little better. This is Burning Mountain. So the interesting part about this is I found another, on the back of this particular photo, it describes the location of where this photo was taken in Newcastle today. And so just to give you an idea where that was at, the brick building across the street, that photo was actually taken looking west towards Burning Mountain. So it changed quickly. Now this is the consolidated, and a lot of these old structures and stuff, It's hard to find photos of them, but what I found was this 1889 drawing, there are a couple of drawings in a publication, and they were, talking about what a great mine this was, the Consolidated Mine, and it was talking about the thickness of the coal and how many miners they employed. And one of the things that's interesting, and Grady, I think you and I talked a little about this. You can see this had 4 different openings feeding this particular. This was a massive coal mine, and you can see this one running up the hill. And if you ever look at that area that's always bare, and it's sinking in, I'm almost certain that is the location of that upper entry. There was 3 other entries at different levels through the mine. There's another drawing of that. Now this is looking down the tipple, and you can see a few buildings. This guy was actually quite an artist. It turned out pretty well. Again, the Consolidated Mine. One of the problems that the Consolidated had was fires, right? It's still on fire. And somebody said, well, those explosions caused the fires. Well, if you start reading back, the fires were already there. What they ended up doing is they started mining this area, and they would seal off areas and try to stay away from the hot spots. But what ended up happening is eventually it would burn through their coal and get into their mining operations. This is another one of the few photos that actually shows the people. And what amazes me about this, look at the age of some of these miners. I mean, it just tells you exactly back in that time, they were using boys mining these things, and it's kind of tragic when you see some of the accidents that occurred. But this is an 1891 photo of the Consolidated, and this guy looks like a fun guy to work with. I mean, he's always got. I think he's packing more than just his lunchbox into that mine. So another view of the Consolidated. You can see there's the old Orange Bridge crossing over that would have taken you to Garfield Creek, Alkali Creek, and also Apple Tree Park at one time. You guys probably see this stack of coal slack still out there as you make the entry into the school. It may be that one or maybe over here. But you can see what they actually did was, you had the Rio Grande and the Consolidated joined into one track from Newcastle going west. And what they did with this, you can see they built these rails in to come under the tipple and fill the coal rails, and then they could send them on out of there. And of course, this is all school land now. This is where the elementary, what is it, elementary, what's it called? Elk Creek Elementary now? Yeah, so this, like I say, this was a vast mine. The problem with it, again, was the fires. And we think that the mine actually got opened and started operating about 1886. By 1899, they shut the mine down because of the fires. So it really didn't even operate that long. And I don't know what, Wheeler and the rest of them had invested in it, but I would think that it didn't pan out all that well with that short term frame. In fact, they sold it out before it was closed. So I think they cut their losses, and it probably didn't help that we had the silver collapse in 1893 as well. So there's another picture of it. You can see these coal slack piles. This was taken, I believe, in 1904, and by that time they had scrapped everything, and it seemed like I was trying to find, you can see the ditch lines. One of the fires they even talk about that they actually diverted the ditch into the mine to try to put the fire out, but it didn't work. And then here's another drawing, and you and I kind of talked about this a little bit. You can see the mines for the Consolidated. Look how they go under the creek into the town. And then this particular mine, I think most of us have always heard that there was a mine that went under the river. Well, you can see that mining going under the river into Coleridge, what we call Coleridge now. Pretty vast. Now, this gentleman's name is Frank Adams. And Frank is the person that discovered the Vulcan coal. And so he got that, he's the one that filed a claim on it. But being a smart guy, he sold it out pretty quickly and let somebody else spend all the money to develop it. And Frank, just to give you a little background on Frank, he's also interred at Highland Cemetery. Frank was the county sheriff for a period of time, I think serving 2 or 3 terms. He had the distinction of being one of those that put the posse together to go after Kid Curry. He was the one that had Kid Curry's body taken to the Newcastle depot where it was shipped to Glenwood Springs. He also became a county commissioner, and he owned a business on Main Street. Reading about his death in 1918, I discovered he had the Spanish flu. Now, they didn't say it in the article, but when it described all of his symptoms, and as quickly as he passed from the Spanish flu in 1918. He has no headstone. There's the Vulcan mine. This was probably around 1912, let's say circa 1910. Again, what Frank had gotten established. There's a look down the Tipple, and I've actually hiked to this spot. I can't find a photo now, about 20 years ago, to take the photo of it, because you can see the coal slack coming down the hill, because this is where the condos are, the River Park condos. So you can see that area. You can also see across the river, there's no development hardly at all over there. Look at that. There's a few fields that have been developed, but that's a lot of sagebrush. Now, we got a guy here that I could do one whole hour on this guy. This is Perry Coryell. Not a very flattering photo, I realize. I'll explain what this is. This says June 26, 1936, Washington State Prison. This is a prison number. He was convicted of murder and spent the rest of his life in prison. He did the murder at 75. I'm going to talk to you a little more about him because there's some really interesting stuff about this guy. Anyway, he had the Coryell mine, also located on the south side of the river, somewhere in the area of Mr. T's. I think maybe a little, I think Russ, we were trying to figure this out one time, maybe a little east of where Mr. T's was. But he was an owner, hated strikers, didn't want strikes, and led to some of the issues I'll be explaining to you. So at this point, we've got the Consolidated, we've got the Vulcan, we've got Coryell, and then the Keystone. I never have been able to find a photo of the Keystone. It was located west of town, about half a mile, and I think you see there's some housing in that area now, and you can see some piles of coal slag. I have seen a mine drawing of it, but I've never found a photo of it. So anybody has one? Just interestingly, this is also miners at the Vulcan mine. Check out the fossil they found while they were doing mining. And this fossil ended up in Denver at one of the state museums. I can't recall off the top of my head where it's at. And I was telling this guy with the pipe, I've got about 4 or 5 photos, and the guy's always like finding his way into a photo. He's got that pipe there. He's like, hey. Now, with all of this activity, we started to see a huge growth in Newcastle of commercial buildings. So the Albany Hotel, Hotel Mason, we ended up with a depot, furniture and hardware stores, clothing stores, Hans Hall, which is an opera house with apartments in the second floor, groceries. There's another hotel, Grand Hotel, which was down just on that side of the street, just a block or two. Of course, this building still remains, the livery, across from what used to be 88 Grill. By the way, this photo every time it comes up, everybody goes, why is that N painted backwards? That was John Adams' store, and I'm sure it was just a way of grabbing attention. You know, it's first schoolhouse. Now that looks shaky, doesn't it? It didn't seem to bother these 3 little ones, but yeah, it looks a little shaky to me. But anyway, it served a purpose. Highland Cemetery was put in place in 1888. I love these. You know, it's like, okay, there's a camera in town. So the Boyce Meat Market in Newcastle, and it couldn't have been here very long because I really haven't found much about it. But what I love about these is everybody shows up with, including their donkey or mule. You just get in the photo. Some more of this, you know, take a picture of the building. But and you had stores like this, which I would kind of call the first, you know, 7-Eleven type things, where they go from one mining community to the other because that's where the real money was being made. It wasn't being made by the miners. Other buildings. These are all Main Street, Newcastle, in a very short period of time. So this photo is, I'm going to say either it looks 1887, could be 1888. The reason I say that, you've got the Colorado Midland Railroad, which came to town in 1887, but you don't have the Rio Grande, which arrived in 1888. So it's that time frame. It's called Newcastle, and we know it wasn't Newcastle until February of 1888. But look at the number of buildings in just that 1883, remember the cabin, and we see the guys hunting lions and stuff. And yet, look at all these buildings. Now, one of the things you'll notice there, I hope this is clear enough back there, but there are almost no residential housing units. It's almost all businesses. You see some tents scattered around. You see more hotels and stuff, which would tend to tell me that a lot of people were living in those motels, using them a lot, like they're getting used today in many places. But that's the first known photo of the town of Newcastle that I believe exists. And in 4.5 years, it's pretty amazing. All frame structures. We'll talk about that a little bit. This guy, most people don't know, is Samuel Wraith, and he was a mining engineer, and he worked both at the Consolidated and for a bit of time at the Vulcan. Samuel Wraith was born in Newcastle upon Tyne, England. And he also was elected to one of the earliest town councils. And he is the one that ended up having the town changed before it was incorporated to Newcastle, Colorado. Prior to that, have you heard Grand Butte well, you're correct. And the reason I'm familiar with that is I actually saw a plat. I worked at the county for 20 years and I was in the clerk's office, came across the Grand Butte plat. Well, before they recorded it, well, I shouldn't say that. They actually recorded it, that's why it's at the clerk's office, but it wasn't incorporated that way. So they basically, if you took the Newcastle plat, which was recorded and incorporated, it's basically an overlay of the Grand Butte plat. He's the guy that basically saw that happen, or influenced people to do that. I mean, he felt like if you had to name Newcastle because of Newcastle, England, and their vast coal production for centuries was a well-known name. In fact, in the United States, I believe there are 18 communities named Newcastle after Newcastle, England, and the majority of those are mining communities. Bobby Gordon, wish he was here. Bobby Gordon was a kid in Newcastle, Wyoming, and he moves to Newcastle, Colorado. Merritt Venter. We got a street named after him down here. Newcastle's first mayor, elected in 1888. Interesting guy. He had a store, and it's really difficult from the description, but it almost appears like it was closer to Davis Point between here and Silt. A very early story. When they moved to Newcastle, he ended up opening one of the very first stores here. And in fact, if you get a chance, take a look at this map that's up here on this table, because it's about 1888, 1889, and it shows it basically was an advertisement for Newcastle. And so you've got all these businesses listed around there, and you'll see that he's got, sells cigars, peanuts, all kinds of stuff. But anyway, he was also appointed as the postmaster after the death of Jasper Ward. He ended up, in those days they had one-year elections. Would you love that, Mindy? Yeah. So he served 3 terms, which meant 3 years. And then his son-in-law, see if I got that next. No, churches were being built. This is the first church that was built, which Congregational Church, which was over on, what is it, 6th Street? 6th Street, right? Yeah, 6th Street. No longer there. That's all housing in here now. Here's when you started to see, 1890, you started to see brick structures. Look at this school. It was up the top of 4th Street. Absolutely gorgeous, beautiful school. The same designer, architect that designed this is the one that designed the Glen Springs Pool. And built in 1892. You see these other, this is the dental offices here now. We always call it the Odd Fellows building. This is when it was being operated as a general store, but brick, constructed of brick again. And then Ritter and McRae. Everybody take a look at the Ritter and McRae cash register in the back. That was in this building. That building still exists, I believe. Which restaurant? Lazy Bear? Could be Lazy Bear. And then what is the name of the business next to that? It's like a general store. It's a little grocery store. Okay. So these two buildings are kind of interchangeable, and because one of the reasons for that is Ritter ended up managing HR Cam's business for a while, and they were both kind of the similar business, and they were right next door to each other. So, whoops, why'd you do that? The post office, which was at the time the old Stone Saloon, and still there today. That's Eat Bistro. And then there's another picture. This is kind of the corner. So those are actually, you got John Ritter, John McRae, John's wife, Mary Ritter, Al Beardsley. There's, this is like the grouping of people that helped form the history here. Nice brick building. And then, of course, we're all familiar with the building. Unfortunately, I don't have anything from that era. They weren't selling gas in, the first 30 years, I don't think. But beautiful building. Great photo. I love this photo. And there's HR Cam. So that's the corner we were just looking at a few minutes ago, and that's Mr. Cam standing in front. And everything, that's on the edge of Ritter Plaza. And then this old building, which used to be down between 7th Street and the creek, again, not able to find a photo from that era, but this will work, gives you an idea. Not only did bricks start to come in, new bridge was built. So Roderick's Ferry, which is the last ride that was given in this photo, you can see the timbering under the bridge is still there, so it's just getting ready to open. So we were getting uptown. We had our own bridge for people to get to Garfield Creek and Alkali Creek. And there's a picture of the bridge once it was completed. Again, later on, you can still see that coal slack pile. That's where the Elk Creek Elementary School is today. There's a bridge. There's a picture of the bridge. The reason this picture was taken, it was taken down shortly after this when I-70 came through. We had a cement factory. This would have been located, we call it the Hidden Valley Ranch, which is right next to Castle Valley. So if you go by the Castle Valley entrance up 7th Street, it's going to be that first right. They had a cement factory back there. Corey Perriell was part of that. He helped finance, put that in place. John Ritter was involved in this. These are some of your business leaders at the time. They're standing next to the Trimble building there at Ritter Plaza. Within that photo, I believe there were 4 mayors. In fact, if you take a look at the mayor photos over at Newcastle, many of those are ones that I got blown up here. And then, of course, we got this guy. We'll talk about him later. It's kind of obvious the way he stands, isn't it? There's something wrong with this dude. Baseball was a huge thing in town back in those days. The mining companies would pay, so we really had semi-pro players. So they would have miners that worked for them that were actually skilled at the game, and they played. And these were serious games. They put a lot of time and energy into this. You can see there's the road to the bridge. You can see the old orange bridge. This used to be the baseball field, and of course they wanted to take this because they beat Rifle 4-2. But look at the stands and stuff. And this, I don't know exactly when. I believe 1913. So you can look at the vehicles that are parked behind a lot of the people that are in the stands. (1891) 4th of July horse racing on Main Street. I mean, look at the number of people that are here. Hunting trip. So everybody knows where the Mativi building is. This was back when, sorry, my brain's freezing up here. I can't remember the guy's name. This guy owned the livery that was there. The livery, when the Mativis ended up putting up Mativi building, this is Spirits of Newcastle before it was ever stuccoed. This is Eat Bistro. And there's a great shot of it. This photo is 1912. Kind of gives you, what all of this coal mining brought to this community and how quickly it just exploded, really. And that's, again, we're talking about that 30-year time frame, and the town will have changed, and we'll get into some of that. Another one of those great photos. Now, I thought this was interesting. Here's the population of Newcastle from the first time it was incorporated so that they could get census data on it through 2020. We know what's happened in this time frame. In this time frame, it doesn't look like anything was going on except 1893. And the reason I put this together is if you get a chance, I've got in that framed map over there is a Sanborn map. Is everybody familiar with what a Sanborn map is? For those of you who aren't, basically, municipalities used to get mapping done of their town, and they would identify whether it was frame construction, whether it was residential construction, if it was commercial, what kind of business was going in it, and if it was stone, they wanted to know all of this information because they were providing insurance for the community. And there were so many fires that we know wiped out sections of Chicago and San Francisco, and so these Sanborn maps really are very typical. I mean, you can go online and you can find them for almost every community across the country. Anyway, this one was done in 1893. Well, if you look at the 1890 census, it says 311. 1900, 10 years later, it's only 431. Well, on that Sanborn map, it says 1,800 people. I think my opinion on this is that these miners that were coming in from all kinds of nations. So they may have had a work visa, but they weren't considered a citizen or a resident, so they weren't being counted in the census. There was certainly a lot more people here. I think from the time I was a kid, people said, yeah, Newcastle was at 2,000 people at one time. And then, of course, this was back in a time frame when I knew we had like 560. So I was thinking, wow, that thing was really booming. Where are they all living? So anyway, you can see, when I call it the quiet period, I mean, not a whole lot of change in that community. John Ritter. Okay, so John's probably one of those guys that we need to talk about because in the early days, he was really kind of the guy that kept things together because, the mine explosions and the mine shutting down, the consolidated shutting down, he kept a business in town and he loaned money to people. They, of course, had charge accounts. He ended up owning Apple Tree Park back in I believe it was the 30s, because there was a debt against it that couldn't be paid, so he ended up acquiring, which was a farmland in those days, but at one point he owned that property. So he was also served mayor, I believe, 13 years at different times. So that's 13 different times he was elected. Mindy? No. So he became the second mayor right after his father-in-law. And so he did about three or 4 years, and he was really the glue that held the community together. And recognizably, throughout the county, he was recognized as the Newcastle guy, and he was well respected throughout the county. That's his partner, John McCrae. Also became mayor for a short period of time. John ended up with illness and sickness, and I read some articles about, towards that he was, he would go someplace to get recuperation, and he'd be back, and he'd go, and he'd come back, and he was elected county treasurer at one time as well. So he was well known and well thought of in the community as well. But he ended up passing in 1921. And the thing about his passing, and here's the interior shot of the Ritter store, and you'll see this cash register right back there. John, his partner, so they opened the business in 1892. He passed in 1921. John kept the business going with the name Ritter McCrae up until the day he died. which was 1944, and believe it or not, he was 80-some years old, crossing the street to go to his home, which was up here, I believe, on, what is that, 3rd Street, 2nd Street, and got hit by a vehicle and was killed at 80-some years old. But he never changed the name of the store in honor of his good friend, John McCrae. There's another picture of the interior. You can see John standing here in the back. These are the Zarlingos. Raphael? Yeah. Great photo. And then there's the front, and then John McCrae standing out front of the Ritter McCrae. I believe that's 1890s some point. And there's John standing in Ritter Plaza. How appropriate. You can see the old bistro in the background. This was taken in probably the 1930s. Again, we go back to the Vulcan. So let's talk about the mines. So the Vulcan mine, I've got my notes here somewhere. There are 84 miners that are interred in Highland Cemetery. And 2 of those from the Consolidated mine, 2 are from the Coryell mine. 1 is from a mine that's not listed as to where, I've read the article, but it doesn't actually identify. 79 from the Vulcan. What I've been able to learn here is that the Consolidated wasn't dangerous, they're all dangerous. They weren't as dangerous. They didn't seem to have the issues. And my concern is, I think a lot of that had to do with operation and how safely they were being operated. Because we're talking about the same coal bed. And in reading some of the explosions as we know, the Vulcan exploded in 1896, and it killed 49 miners. In fact, it killed everybody who was on duty that day. So, and that was due to methane buildup. And we all understand the methane and coal and that issue. When it exploded in 1913, there were 37 miners killed. And that one was dust, and the company leasing it was the Perry Coryell Leasing Company that was operating at the time. And he had been accused on many occasions of operating unsafe mines. And really, I believe that's about the time when that happened. Every one of the miners' families received $1,000 because they found the company operating the mine illegally. They weren't properly wetting the dust, and that's what it was. It was somebody opened, with the flames, an open flame and dust, and it exploded. And if you read some of the stories of the 1896 newspaper article that I believe is from the Newcastle News, I mean, they didn't leave out any details. They told you exactly, what happened to these people. And they were talking about when that explosion happened, it blew timbers clear into the Colorado River. So, I mean, the force that came out of that. One of the true tragedies was the Dorr family. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Dorr family, but they had 4 boys working in the mine. And they were all on the same shift. And the youngest was 14, and he was the one at the front of the mine. So he would kind of take, I don't know, rings or whatever they do. He was not actually within the mine. And it blew him out of the front of that mine 40 yards. And they used the building here as a temporary morgue when they were going through this process. And they brought his body up there, and he was still alive but didn't last but maybe an hour or 2. He lost his other 3 brothers, all of whom were in their teens. And if you're ever at Highland Cemetery, there's a spot where they're all buried together, including the father, and then there was another son that was not old enough to work at the time, and the mother. So it's if you know the story behind the Dorr family, it's extremely tragic, and it talks about back in those days, they did whatever they could to try to make money, and it didn't matter what your age was, I suppose, to some level. Again, that particular explosion, operated by a different company, was due to methane. One of the things that is interesting to me is that I read an article, and when I say article, sometimes they're just a snippet in the paper. You know how all those snippets are. And after the 96 explosion, they moved the mine east. And I think a very short distance. In fact, some of the work that's gone on behind the condo. There's a concrete. I'm curious as to if that was the original location of the Vulcan before it got moved to its last location, which is shown in this photo. This is really an extraordinary photo, even though it's not in very good shape. This is actually miners after the explosion. You can see the timbers and everything at the Vulcan. And I'm assuming this is the crew that's trying to get things cleaned up. It took, I forget the number of weeks. One of the misnomers, when I was a kid, I was told, you know, there's still some miners buried in there. They were all accounted for. All of the miners were accounted for. Now, we had mining issues, and then we also had train issues. So we had the explosion in 1896, right? And then 1897, we had the Rio Grande and the Midland do a head-on out here about where the crossover is in Peach Valley. So you go past the Peach Valley entrance, and there's that crossover the interstate in about that location. So we had Colorado Midland train coming back from Rifle, and we had a Rio Grande passenger train leaving Newcastle. And there was miscommunication as to the timing of that leaving. And remember, as I mentioned, they joined forces, so there was only one rail between Rifle, well, actually, I thought that was me for a minute. From Newcastle all the way to Junction was one rail, and they shared it. And in this particular instance, it was a very tragic event. You can see the two engines as they lit into each other. This gives you some photo. The original newspaper reports said, yeah, 60 people killed in this train. And it was, even though it wasn't 60 people. Then later I saw an article where it said 49 people killed in this train. Well, in researching it, I spent about 6 months doing this, finding every newspaper article I could find online related to this train accident. 22 seems to be the number, still a big number. And most of those people died from burning in the train. I mean, it was a very tragic event. Both engineers were killed, both the firemen, the guys keep the, which is obvious. And some of those, I mean, those two firemen died a very difficult death. They were basically, you can imagine, the steam and water. And, some additional photos of this. You can see the people kind of standing out to the side around the wreckage. The dead cattle. There were a lot of cattle in that train coming on the Midland. And again, you know, right after the events of the 1896 explosion. Now, let me talk about this. There were no Newcastle residents on these trains. As you start going through it, you see some people from Aspen. I mean, they were from like 3 or 4 different states. People, I mean, clear from California, Illinois. The family from Illinois, it was two young, husband and wife. They were each 29 years old. They lost 2 children, a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. And there's a picture of the Midland train when they pulled it back to Colorado Springs. You can see that I'm not legally the owner of this photo. It's a Colorado artifact. And we had other stuff going on. So 1904, I'm doing this all from memory, so the years sometimes I may be off one, but 1904, there were strikes that were going on since 1894. And one of the biggest, one of the individuals really fighting against these strikes was Corey Periel. He didn't want it affecting. He would bring in people to replace those people, and of course that created problems. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, here's one house. 4 houses were dynamited. And these 4 houses belonged to Union mine leaders. I didn't keep much of a yard, did he? I always look at these photos, I go, did anybody have any grass back in those days? This looked like tumbleweed. Anyway, this is John Lawson's, and I'll be talking about John here in a little bit. John was like one of the high-up guys in the Union. And then the second floor of the Hans Hall was also dynamited. And I've always been curious about that because I never found a photo of them showing what the damages were, but I did find this old photo of Hans later. You can see that the roof was redone in a much different way, and I'm not sure it was ever used as a second floor again. And we're bringing his face back up because if you read the articles, he owned the Non-Periel, which was Newcastle's first paper. Now, he didn't own it in the beginning, but he acquired it, and he wrote many of the columns, especially the opinion columns, where he was constantly after the Union. And if you ever get a chance to read some of it, I mean, it's comical in some ways. So when the explosions of the dynamiting of the houses happened, everybody said, this guy did it because he was mad at the strikers. And he's like, no, it wasn't me. And they never did find out who did it. And you realize there was 4 houses that were dynamited plus Hans Hall. This wouldn't have been one guy doing this. They had to have set this stuff. They had to know exactly what was going on. We're talking 2 o'clock in the morning. Nobody got injured from this. So there was something going on. He claims that the Union did it themselves to bring sympathy to their cause. And part of that argument was there was nobody injured, and this was done at 2 o'clock in the morning. How could somebody blow up a house and not injure somebody at 2 o'clock in the morning? So he had a bit of an argument, but when they were doing the inspections, they found out he was short 18 sticks of dynamite. So, you know, there's again some things that point at this. Thankfully, nobody was ever injured, and nobody was ever caught or convicted of anything to do with this. 1905, we had Mr. Teddy Roosevelt visit. He was hunting on Divide Creek, spent some time here in Newcastle. Linda, you recognize that house? Yeah. You know, we used to think that your house was so camera shy until I found these photos. It was like, you know, the president shows up, the house creeps into the photo.
What year is that photo?
1905.
1905.
Yeah. And there's Teddy leaving the depot on the white horse, of course. Of course. And then this is a great picture of him. This is once he's crossed the river. I believe this would be Mountain Shadow subdivision, right where he's standing now. You can see Burning Mountain in the background. Great photo. Okay, now we're going to talk about this guy. Everybody recognize him? Billy Griffith, right? So Billy Griffith, how do you describe him? If you read the newspaper articles, he's a high energy guy, played baseball, was a good baseball player, fierce. I even believe that he served as sometime as a deputy for the town of Newcastle. Art, you can relate? Not really. Anyway, he also owned and ran a bar in downtown, and he beat up one of his patrons one night, an older man, and beat him bad. And so he got charged with assault, and he was found guilty. Well, he decided those people that testified against him are going to pay for this. And one of those people that happened to be in town at the time was somebody helped me with it. It's Sample. It's one of the Sample family members from, was it John? Anyway, he was in town. Billy went and got a pistol and came after him. And John Renix, who was, boy, that really, let me do this one. That's John Renix, here with his daughters, was the town marshal, stepped in between and got shot by Billy Griffith. And ended up, Billy ran across the street. I think he got, I believe, Mr. Renix shot him in the shoulder. He ran up to the second floor of the brick building next to Ritter Plaza, the Trimble building. He was taken to Glenwood. John and Mr. Renix was taken to Glenwood, where he passed the following day. The mayor at the time telegraphed City of Glenwood Springs, and they brought a posse down, a train of 40 men with guns, and they basically lined up and started just shooting into that building, trying to get Billy Griffith. And they claimed, the newspaper article claims, that over 200 rounds were shot into the building. And it used to be, I don't know, I've looked, you used to be able to see bullet marks in that brick building at the front. Now, they didn't kill him. And what happened was the shooting kind of stopped. Let me back up a little bit. When he was up on the second floor of this building and got up there, he saw a Philip Carpenter and what was the other guy's name? Davis, John Davis, walking across the street. John was Mr. Carpenter's son-in-law. He was carrying a rifle that he had borrowed from a guy back to him. And Billy Griffiths, looking at him from the second floor window, thinks that he's coming towards him with this rifle and shoots and kills him. And he also wounds Carpenter. And that's when, this posse shows up. And the article describes people were fleeing the streets, obviously. And anyway, they're shooting into this, and the shooting kind of stops, and they send up a woman friend of his to talk to him, to try to talk him in some sense into him. And didn't work. And then as she was leaving and heading down the stairs, they heard one shot where Mr. Griffith had ended his own life. Both he and Renix and the Davis man and Carpenter all interred up here at Highland Cemetery. So if you're ever out there looking around, you kind of understand who those people might be. Oh, we're back to him. So anyway, I'm going to go into this because it's fascinating, really. Perry Coryell. He's the one that platted the Coryell Addition. So when you talk about Coryell Town, he platted the Coryell Addition. He did it in 1887. He was only 26 years old. So this guy really was a true business leader and quite the entrepreneur. And in looking at this, I think he also had some connection with Jerome Wheeler, because on a lot of the deeds that are transferred from Perry for the Coryell Town lots when he's selling them, Wheeler is also signing off on those. So, and I also know that he managed the Consolidated mine for a short period of time. So the connection there is equally telling that he had some relationship with Jerome Wheeler. Probably Jerome backed away from that at some point, but there's the plat of the Coryell Addition. So you see this, he platted this just north of Newcastle, 1887. It was never a part of the town. That's why people called it Coryell Town, because he had some businesses along North Midland when you go up there. But there was a hotel, there was some retail stores, and he ran this as if he was, the mayor or whatever of that community. He also owned, you can see the Non-Periel. So he owned and was the editor for the Non-Periel. And if you get a chance, read some of those articles. He also did Saddles and Harnesses, but that was Cliff. Multitasking at that building. And again, he managed the Vulcan at the time of the 1913 explosion. And this is John Lawson. So this is one of the stories we talk about. John was kind of the leader here of the Union. And I think this was actually prior to John's house being dynamited. And he was at the barber shop, and there was a strike going on, and Perry had his wife and his son or daughter in the carriage with him, pulled up, grabs his shotgun, walks in, and just shoots the guy. And he shot him in this lower area, and he survived. But he never served any time criminally. He claimed it was self-defense. Sorry, I don't know how you're going to shoot a guy in a barber shop, self-defense. But anyway, but he got sued civilly by Lawson, and Lawson won $2,000, which was, in those days, was a chunk of change. And then this, okay, so here's where things, we told you, 1913, he's managing the mine, explodes, he's found at fault, has to pay out to families. He ends up in Oregon, and he's operating, I believe, a gold mine up there. And he gets cross with one of the guys that was an investor. It was a Cuban that was an investor in the mine and was unhappy with what was coming out of the mine for his share. And so he sued Coryell for that operation of that mine, and he hired an attorney. Coryell had his own attorney, and he went to meet with them to discuss and try to negotiate some kind of settlement for it. At some point, the discussion is not going well. He says to his attorney, hey, you want to leave the room? And he pulls out a gun and kills both of them. Not only that, but so this is him. He's turning himself into The police chief, what does it say? Union City. Yeah. Huh? So anyway, he's turned himself in. He had a knife on him, and these are extra bullets, by the way, in the bag. It's just, you know. So anyway, he ended up, his attorney pleaded insanity, saying he was senile and insane, which probably kept him from getting the death penalty because he was sentenced. He was 75 years old. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he died 10 years later in that prison. And he's actually buried in the prison cemetery up there in Washington. Okay, let's go back, and there's a couple of things I want to talk about here. Again, this is the old photo of the, I want to talk about the Albany. I know Joe and I have disagreed on this at different times. Here's a picture taken, let me just back up. Let's see if this, I actually brought this thing, see if it works. So, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. You can see this building. You see, and you've got two buildings together, and you've got this little building next to it. And so this photo was taken in the same time frame as this photo. So you've got the little building, Hotel Mason, Albany Hotel. And you notice where that was located is actually, because of the bridge, you know that the current school sits in this area. So it's almost at the location of where the Episcopal Church is. And the reason that I spent so much time on this was it was confusing to me because I always knew the Albany was down here. And so when I started looking through these photos, I was like, well, what are they doing? And so there's a photo of again, of that building. And I took the original photo of the aerial type of view, and I was able to actually see this sign on it with a microscope. So and then here's a picture of that building taken looking east. So you can see here's the little building, here's Hotel Mason, Albany Hotel. And if you look at this, that's certainly not Coal Ridge behind it. That is, I believe, Prendergrass Hill. Now, if you look at this build, this is where all of us know it to be, where Jim Scholl's garage is today, on the corner of Cam Avenue. And you can see that the back, there's no building next to it. So we know that that showed up. Let me look real quick. Yeah, so we know it was actually located next to the depot. And just to tell you, the depot is right here. So it makes sense. I think you got a hotel right next to the depot, people unloading. That's so we based upon that Sanborn map in 1893. Well, in 1887, it disappears. It disappears from up here. There's no building. None of those buildings were left in any other photos that I can find. But I can't find an article that says what they did. You know, how did they move it? Did they rebuild it? Did they take it apart, rebuild it? But you can tell that there's obviously two different locations. Now, the building's almost identical, as far as I can tell. The number of windows and everything else matches up with the original. But so it's a mystery. I don't know when that would have occurred, but I thought it was very interesting. And this will also, as part of that, you'll notice, remember we had two railroads coming in. So they had different ideas about a depot. So here was the depot grounds, it says right here on the map, depot grounds, and it was across these lots, which is where the Midland ultimately got built. Depot grounds, which would have been the Rio Grande coming in. And in this location is where that picture of the Albany kind of shows up. So if they were playing their hat towards the Rio Grande, they were going to want to be closer to the Rio Grande depot. When the two decided they were only going to use one depot, which was down here, all of a sudden, you know, the Albany's right there. Bizarre. Just shows you what those guys will do. Grady, I went back to your photo because this, look at Elk Creek. How you used that big old curl coming in and out of here. And even the lot's all platted on this side of the creek, up where the mine is and now where the school property is. And 1895, they actually did this. They cut through and did away with the creek bed here and created a new creek bed. And if you're familiar with walking across that bridge, you look up there, it's a straight shot. This thing was taking up a lot of usable land. And if you look at some of the old photos, the road coming around was really cutting into the slope to get back up to this area. And it probably explains why we kind of have that turn and the way this road works today with ownership.
Did you say 1895? Would they have done that by hand?
Yeah. Well, horses and donkeys and I'm sure mules and yeah. Okay, why are we back here? Let's see. Oh, I know what this was. Let me back up. I remember. All right. Now also, just another piece for, when you guys are sitting around playing poker or whatever. We know this is Bernie Mountain, right? We also know, based upon newspaper articles from literally like the 1885, 86 era, that the mountains were named. This was named Ward's Peak after Jasper Ward. The three guys got together with their, the article I read. Newspaper article says that the three of them were together having dinner and drinks at actually a house right where that Trimble building is, the brick building. And they decided to name the mountain. So they named this one Ward's Peak. Medeiros is one of the people who are there. And Roderick's Range, which we all know today as Coleridge. And Roderick's owned the area where Apple Tree is and a lot of those lands running up into Garfield Creek. But he got benefit of a whole range, I guess. Over the years, because we know the mountains are on fire, this used to be a lot more prevalent. You would see this kind of thing happen, and you can see there's quite a bit of smoke where they've busted through. You were talking about that one area that caved in. These are areas where the flames tend to make the ground dry, and they collapse in, and then you end up getting this smoke. So these are some 1930 photos. But remember, you guys ever remember this? What, about 5, 6 years ago? We had one of those happen. That's the first time I'd seen it in 30 years, I'll bet. So that's an ongoing thing. We all know what's happening over there. Okay, so the Midland Bridge, 1913. So everything happens in the first 30 years. So everything that needed to happen was going to happen by 1913. So we've got this bridge, and I brought a map of the Colorado Midland Railroad. And if you take a look at it, it's kind of interesting. So this section, in one of the trips, what? Dang it. This happens. Now, nobody got injured, but if you go look at that Midland, this was the lightest steel that they were using on the Midland. You could go through sections of this, and it was like, this section was laid in 1887, and you can see the other ones where they're beefing up the steel as they're going along. They didn't quite get here in time. Town Hall built, let's see what the year was, 93, I think. There's a town hall. Everybody familiar with where Town Hall is? You can see it's even got the bell tower and everything for the fire department. It was originally designed that way. Hose House is what they call it. This is the Newcastle News, November 18th, 1893. Week ending January 28th, the council meeting for the first time. They did a contract to build this for $790. They got robbed. It cost $1,000. The old school on the hill. Now, the photo that I showed you before was taken from a different angle. It was taken in this angle. And if you recall, it had a big tower. Came up this size. It was actually taller than... The building was built in 1892. The tower was the first thing to go. It just, the soils were not good. They couldn't handle it. The tower was taken down. From what I can tell, about 1910, 1911, they quit using it as a school because it was condemned. And I believe this photo is probably from that era, 1912. You can see the grounds are not kept. unless John Lawson was the same guy that lived next door. But you could see with that other photo with the kids out there that the grounds were neat. There wasn't any grass or anything. But this tells me, you start looking at some of these photos and you can tell what's going on with that building. And it's sort of tragic. What a gorgeous building. So it only was in operation really 1892 to 1910. Top of 4th Street. And that's when they built this. 1913 is when it opened, so actually construction started in 1912. They were taking, students were being held in different, classes were being held in different places around town while this being built. Interesting thing about that building is first, no front doors. Everything's got a side door entry. And even if you look at this, I should have put another photo up here with where the doors are in place. But even these windows, you know, those actually got changed. So we got doors that were put in here. The windows were actually expanded. It's still kind of cool. Not nearly as attractive as the first building, but still a nice building. And there we have the town that we all love today. And that's really all I have for you. I hope I didn't keep you too long. There's a lot of stuff. I didn't touch on a lot of stuff, but
You're willing to hang around for a question?
yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. This is a wonderful presentation. He's offered to stick around to answer any other questions about Newcastle. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you.
So before anybody gets too carried away, I'm Grady Hazelton. This is Kelly. This is the part you didn't have planned, and this is very organized, but we're going to change, we're going to flip the script, as they say, a little bit here.
Oh, wow.
What we'd like to do is start something new, and I'll have Kelly kind of tell us what we got here.
So, in your honor, Steve, because of all the decades, it's just a small way of showing our appreciation for the decades of reporting and organizing the history of Newcastle. We've established the Local Historian Legacy Award, and in honor of lifetime resident Steve Rippy, you're the first recipient.
Wow. I didn't see that.
This will be hung at Town Hall,
Very cool.
and then this is for you to take home.
Nice. Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
The work that Steve has done is unprecedented in the hours that he's put into it. If you're not part of Facebook, or this is a reason to be on Facebook. The old photographs of Newcastle, the site that he has for the cemetery. If you haven't been to the cemetery, it's one of the most beautiful places in Newcastle.
Yeah.
And I suggest you go up there and just take a look around. And Steve, this is just a small token, as Kelly said, and thank you so much.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. Seriously. You little sneaky guys.
Also,
Just to say one thing, I brought some things with me. I think if you enjoy the history, there's some really cool stuff to look at over here, and I'll help explain some of it with you.
we're not done.
Okay.
So we also have Steve's sons here, Casey and Steven, and they're going to come up here and read a dedication that's connected to this award that was written by Steve's good friend and former Mayor of Newcastle, Bill Winslow.
Oh, wow. Sneaky dogs.
Let's put us up to it. So Bill, if you guys don't know, Bill wanted to be here today, but unfortunately schedule wouldn't allow him. So I'm going to read part of it and then give your own copy. Yeah. Thank you. I'm drawing a copy for him. So pretend Bill is reading it. All right. Now that we've learned so much from Steve's presentation about Newcastle's first 30 years, I'd like to highlight a few things I've witnessed over Newcastle's last 30 years. I first met Steve in April of 1995 on a mostly barren lot on Alder Avenue in Newcastle's newest, and at that time, the only park in the 80-home Castle Valley Ranch development. The park was usually basic, with improvements created out of donations and resident volunteer efforts, consisting of a simple swing set, sand volleyball court, and sod. It was Arbor Day, and Mr. Rippy was there with a member of the town maintenance staff to plant a tree, the first tree in what is now K. Williams Park. There was no agenda or planned program other than to dig a hole and plant a small root ball in it. My impression was that Steve wasn't really expecting anyone to show up. I was pleasantly surprised that a handful of us took the time to attend. He was just there to plant a tree because that's what Steve Rippy does. He truly loves the town of Newcastle and has always offered his time and his effort in every way possible to nurture, improve, and preserve his community however he can. His planting of that tree almost 30 years ago is just one small example of Steve's love and commitment to our area. So many of his contributions are simply unknown to most of us and unheralded because Steve has no desire to receive recognition of these things that brings him tremendous joy and satisfaction. That's what Steve Rippy does. All of Newcastle's present, past, future, and extended community benefit immeasurably from Steve's humble efforts. And since leaving his post as public servant, mayor, and town administrator, he continues his labor of love by researching, documenting, gathering, and sharing the narratives that weave the ever-unfolding stories that reveal Newcastle's history. I am told that Steve's interest in the town's history first began showing itself shortly after he was appointed to town council, and the topic of Newcastle's past mayors came up in discussion at a historical society meeting. But the town had no photographs of its past leaders. So Steve took it upon himself to start calling the old-timers to get photographs and information about the former mayors. He researched new stories at the library and museum, contacted out-of-state family members, and after more than 20 years of continued persistence, he's been able to hang portraits of all the Newcastle mayors in Town Hall, except for 2. But he's determined to complete that collection and continues running down leads to this day. That's what Steve Rippy does. In the 1990s, when many of the town board members were focused on doing our best to maintain working water and sewer systems and learning to drive a snowplow, Steve had discovered, among other things, that plot burial records for Highland Cemetery were in disarray. He began working on verifying, updating, and correcting the cemetery plot map. As part of that work, Steve's historical fascination and understanding of the community record continued evolving and growing. He continues expanding and sharing his Highland Cemetery research to this day through the cemetery Facebook group he started. I'll talk about that shortly. Pretend I'm Bill. Many of you will remember that Steve and others guided the efforts to revitalize Burning Mountain Park. With the updated park centerpiece, the miner statue honoring all the men lost to that devastating mine explosion in the town's early days, Steve painstakingly researched the news, historical records, and cemetery to ensure every family's loss was remembered and memorialized permanently in that monument. During the same time, Steve was directing the town's downtown redevelopment project and really gained momentum at the beginning of the new millennial. Steve made certain that the design incorporated in the unique Newcastle historical flavor we enjoy today, and made sure to find funding and design expertise to convert Ritter Avenue to Ritter Plaza and develop the area in front of Pete Mativi's automobile business as Mativi Plaza. These are only the highlights and things I remember or even know about. There's so much more that Steve's done and is doing. Whether he intended it or not, most will agree that the vast library of archives and history he has amassed and now shares freely has earned him as being known as the town's de facto historian. But wait, there's more.
That's gonna be hard. But now you guys picture me. These are only the highlights. Oh, sorry. He wasn't very good at keeping track of where he was on the page. I'm trying to be true to the character. The Facebook pages that Steve runs are treasured gifts for us all. And the participation of so many individuals in these groups shows how important Steve's work is and how much it is truly appreciated. Each Facebook group that he started has created a community of fascination and interest in the history he shares. He has truly brought together a plethora of resources and individuals that will continue unveiling more about Newcastle's past and the people that are a part of that history. The Newcastle's Highland Cemetery and History of Those Interred is a resource that matches up the cemetery's headstones and burial records with the stories and photographs of those remembered from Steve's ever-growing collection. The cemetery Facebook group has more than 800 living members. I'm told that people are dying to get in. Casey had that.
Yeah.
We argued over who was going to start and who was going to end it based on that line.
Good choice.
Then there's the Facebook group Newcastle Old Photographs and History, which has more than 3,300 members and is full of Steve's historical photos as well as pictures submitted by its many members. If you haven't seen it, you need to go check it out. And lastly, there are 2,700 members of Newcastle, Colorado, its people, life, and beauty. A final Facebook page Steve administers with more current photographs and community sharing. The ever-growing content on all these websites is more than just pictures and stories. There's much discussion and narrative passed down over time with Steve and so many neighbors or relatives. It's just one more example of Steve's sincere commitment to creating a meaningful and sustained community. Newcastle is deeply blessed that Steve has dedicated so much of his life to exploring and documenting our history. But knowing Steve well, I would confidently state that he is even more blessed than us in this whole history business. He is the one living his passion of uncovering, documenting, and understanding the people and the works that came before us. And as his understanding of Newcastle's past grows, he passes these treasures on to all of us that wish to know them. And that knowledge of where the community has come from, the changes brought on by great times, disaster, sacrifice, and fortitude is invaluable as we learn about Newcastle's past and face tomorrow's issues. It is truly my honor and privilege to have Steve Rippy as my dear friend. And just like the tree he planted 30 years ago, Steve continues sowing and cultivating seeds of passion for the town of Newcastle, its people, life, and beauty. It's just what Steve Rippy does. No one is more deserving. Wow, didn't know that I would choke up over buildings. No one is more deserving of recognition as the first recipient of the Newcastle, Colorado Local Story and Legacy Award. Congratulations, Steve, and thank you for all you've done for us. Did you want to leave? We just wanted to say a couple words ourselves. My dad, he loves this town, and it is wonderful to see how many people love him in exchange. He's been a public servant for as long as I've been alive. 25 years, that's crazy. And it's closer to 40. And I don't know, most of you probably know, but when you work as a public servant, most of the time you don't get everybody's best. A lot of times you see them at their worst. But my dad has always been the type of person, it doesn't matter if they give you their best, you always give them their best until they leave the building. And then you talk about them as much as you want to with the other groups. Not every day that you get to honor your dad and your hero at the same time. And I was told Peyton Manning would be here. I feel a little cheated, but I'll take my dad instead.
You know, it's funny, when I think of my dad and how much he loves this town, no matter what you're talking about when we come to visit, the town always seems to come up. And some sort of history of the town, and he lights up when he's talking about it. He will, oh, you know, have I shown you this photo? Or he'll tell you a whole story about it. And you saw a lot of that in that presentation. And I remember back when Schroeder's was in town, and we lived close to, that was my first job, was at Schroeder's. And before that, I remembered it was McGlincy's, and I'm sure Morley's before that. And then my parents bought it. My dad bought it. And I just assumed it'd be Rippy's. So, you know, I work here at Rippy's. But that wasn't my dad. My dad didn't want to name it Rippy's. He loved the town, named it the Newcastle General Store. And I have one funny story that I remember. I don't know if you remember it. But he'd always want to, we'd do these hikes all the time. My brother and I would get excited. We're going to hunt for lizards. I didn't know there was an ulterior motive. Dad would always take pictures of the town. We'd climb to the top of Burning Mountain, or the hogback, or I don't even know what this was. Climb to the top, and he'd always take these pictures. Well, one time, this is probably 25 years ago or so, and we wanted to climb, and we went up the old cemetery road, and I want to say it was like February or something, and you had these shoes that you probably had for a decade, and they had no tread, like literally anti-tread. They were like racing slicks, and we hiked up, and it wasn't so bad hiking up. And we go, it's February, so there's like, you know, the shaded areas have snow and stuff, and we take some pictures of the town. And walking back, it was muddy, mess. I think you fell between 20 times. It just kept... And I was dying laughing. I was in stitches the whole time because he could not walk down this mountain. But it was all because he just really wanted to get this picture of the town. I think he wanted to get the general store in the photo, and it just showed like what lengths his passion went to. Not with proper attire or anything, but no, you've always had such a pure passion, and you love talking about it, and I don't think there's a more deserving person of this first award. So
Thank you.
That's it. No more.